it more, but I'll call us to order. We're here for a joint meeting, City Council, Wellhead Protection, Environmental Committee, and Public Works. All of us together because the issue was important enough that the City Council thought we should all meet as one group. And that issue is the reports that the city received regarding the water contamination stemming from the Midtown gas site over on, well, right off the corner there on Lake over by the elementary school. Just in case there's somebody who doesn't know the history, I'll go over it just very quickly. It's widely suspected that that site leaked thousands and thousands of leaded gas into the ground over the course of many years. And that gas leached into the aquifer and made its way into the city's, well, into where we were pumping water. It never, I don't think, hit the water supply, but maybe I'm misremembering. Back in the day, it was found in our wells and it was detected. Remediation was, some remediative efforts were taken, and I'll let the bar people go into a little bit more about what was done because they'll know the specifics, whereas I won't. In order to make sure that the benzene and the contaminations from that leaded gas didn't make its way into our residents' homes and into the taps, because that was the most important thing for all of us. There was a news story that hit the air a few years ago. MPCA employee Mark Tuso. Mark, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pick on you a little bit just to get the story. Mark left the MPCA and filed a whistleblower lawsuit saying, hey, look, I was pushing the MPCA to take more action on towns like Paynesville, and they ignored me and punished me for doing it. And he spoke up in his lawsuit, and that garnered some media attention, drove some public interest here and more regionally in making sure that the steps the MPCA took were sufficient. Among the biggest thing that happened was we constructed the VOC plant, which is just on Old Highway 23 on the east side of town. On the north side, it's the white building there behind the Historical Society. So if any contaminants were ever found in the drinking water supply, they would be treated by that VOC plant and they could be removed from there. Mark's suggestion, going back and arguing, was that that's not enough. We have to clean up the site itself. That needs to be cleaned up, remediated, and that the MPCA shut down that because they don't want to spend the money on it. And Mark, apologies if I'm putting this too much in a nutshell for you, but Mark has been gracious enough to stay involved as part of that process. We reached out to him with the lawsuit and got more information, and he's been generously giving of his time to provide insight and help and information to us as a city as we guide this process going forward. But as a result of the interest from that lawsuit, we reached out to our local representatives and they got us funding for a study. And that study looked at a number of cities. They were all the cities that Mark named in his lawsuit, to look at whether or not the MPCA had done enough. Tarek, our city administrator, was sort of the admin of the study, the coordinator of it. Looked at and hired Bar Engineering. They conducted the study, provided the city with that report a couple of months ago. It generated probably as many questions as it answered, I think, but that's okay. That's why we're here tonight. And I think the question still rings as to whether or not there are options, viable options, I think, for greater cleanup of the site in order to protect the safety of our water supply in the future. There is no immediate concern. The water is safe, it's been tested, it's good, but it's looking into the future to make sure that hopefully we would never need that VOC plant, that chemical plant that's there. It's currently sitting there, it's not operating, it's ready to go at a moment's notice if we ever do need it, but what might we be able to do in order to protect it going forward? So that's, in a nutshell, why we're here tonight. The way this is going to work, as far as I see it, is we'd start with just the way our agenda is laid out, as Bar presenting their report first. Mark had written to us, expressed some additional things for us to consider. I'd like to hear from Mark. And then I think if anybody on the council or if anybody on the committees has questions, we can take those sort of one at a time. I don't know that we're going to get answers for everything tonight. I don't want this to turn into a debate back and forth about what's better, because I don't think that, I'm not qualified to answer that, but what I might like to know is how can we maybe better phrase some questions, or if we need to go out and look at other experts to bring in other people, where can we go, or what should we be looking at for that? What questions should we be asking, and where do we go to get the answers? Because this is something that the city's been dealing with for decades. I'd quite like it to be done. But that means that we need to do it right this time. Not that it was necessarily done wrong, but let's put in the effort, let's do the work, and let's make damn sure it's done right, so that there are no questions left up in the air. That's what I'd like to see. I don't think tonight is about getting all of the answers, but hopefully it's about helping us formulate the questions that we need to ask, so that we can go to the right places and get answers. Procedurally, we have a couple of microphones down there, so maybe once we're done, it might make sense for Bar and Mark to sit at a microphone. I'm just thinking out loud a little bit, and then if anybody on the committees wants to ask a question or something like that, I just ask that you go to the podium, because otherwise we're not going to be able to hear you. Or I might be able to hear you, but Kristen in the back, who's trying to take minutes, won't, and I won't remember to repeat what you had said. So just to make sure that we all know what's going on and we can look back on it in the future, I just ask that we get microphones before we do anything. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Sheridan.
Great.
Thank you.
She's all right if I sit
Yep.
here for the presentation? Hi, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to come here to Paynesville. For those of you on the council that were here when I last presented in June, it's nice to see you again. So just to give you a little bit of background on myself, my name's Sarah Ramsden. I'm a senior environmental engineer and vice president at Bar Engineering, and I do have over 20 years of experience in contaminated site investigation and cleanup. And I am the principal in charge of the ENRT project at Bar. My colleague Sheridan Braun is here as well. She's an environmental engineer at Bar. And as Mayor Ranke mentioned, there were 4 cities involved in this study. Sheridan was the lead on the Paynesville site review, the file review and things like that. So I've asked her to join me today as well. Next slide, please, Tarek. Thank you. So I'll walk through just a couple of things today. I do want to keep the presentation brief so we have time for questions and things like that. I'll go over a very brief background and overview of the ENRT project that resulted in the report that was submitted to Paynesville, the granting agency, and the other 3 cities involved in the study.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Could you explain the acronyms? Because a lot of us don't understand what the acronyms mean.
Yes, I certainly will.
Thank you.
Yep. So ENRT, and I've tried to where I can, the slides have definitions for some of the acronyms as well.
Sure.
But ENRT is the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust. So that is basically the fund where the funding for the report that Bar did came from. It's a state fund, and that it sounds like the legislators associated with each of the 4 cities requested and received that funding. And definitely, please feel free to stop and ask questions during the presentation as well. I'll give a very brief overview of petroleum contamination, how that can happen to groundwater, and then we'll dive into some of the details on the former Midtown Service Station site itself, including the investigations that MPCA conducted over the years, feasibility studies and evaluations that they did to see how the site might be cleaned up if that was deemed necessary, the cleanup work that was done, and some recommendations from that report, as well as just some other considerations for the city to take into account. And next slide, please. So a brief background and overview of the ENRT project that produced the report. So the scope was an analysis of the extent of leaded gasoline contamination in and near 4 cities, including Painesville. So the other 3 cities were Foley, Alexandria, and Blaine. And at all 4 of these cities, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency conducted the investigation and cleanup evaluation at each of these sites because there was not what we call a responsible party that was still associated with the sites, like a viable company or business that in some cases would pay for the investigation and cleanup. But in these cases, that responsible party was no longer viable or the source was never found. So really, the scope of the report was a third-party technical review. That's why BAR was hired to evaluate the risk posed by the petroleum contamination to each city's drinking water supply. So we really focused on that particular media or pathway, drinking water. You know, we didn't necessarily look at soil contamination, we didn't look at vapor intrusion, and we did not look at other potential contaminants besides leaded gasoline. So we really had a fairly narrow scope to look at under the approved funding for the report. So as part of that work, we reviewed each city's current and historical water supply, and importantly for what we've been asked to focus on for this meeting, we requested and reviewed files and records from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Minnesota Department of Health related to the investigation and cleanup actions completed at these sites. Specific to Painesville, BAR requested and received over 150 files from the MPCA. We looked through each of those to determine which were the pertinent reports to review. And out of that, around 35 were very closely reviewed as key documents for Painesville. As mentioned, the work at this site has gone on for a long time. And I'll show a timeline of the investigations that were completed by the agency. But there were a lot of records and files to review just for Painesville. And we also visited each city and discussed with MPCA staff, you know, sometimes some of the current work that's been done at these sites wasn't yet in the file, so we wanted to make sure that we understood, you know, what had happened in the last year or two, or anything that we may have, some gaps that may have been in our review of the files. So that work culminated in the summary report that again was shared with Painesville and that was submitted to the fund, to the ENRT group in late May of this year, in 2024. Next slide, please. So just a really quick overview of how the petroleum contamination can get into groundwater, both in Painesville and just generally. So petroleum storage, whether that's in above-ground storage tanks or underground storage tanks, like at the gas station where you fill up your car or your truck, it's a very common cause of groundwater contamination. If those tanks leak, the contamination can move downward through the soil and then into the groundwater. So the graphic we show here, you know, shows a UST, an underground storage tank, that's leaking, and the contamination is flowing downward through the soil column and into the groundwater. And you'll hear us talk a little bit about what we call LNAPL or NAPL, or free product. NAPL stands for non-aqueous phase liquid. It's basically the free product or the gasoline because it's less dense than water, that sometimes can be found kind of in that kind of pure gasoline form at the top of the groundwater table. So you'll hear us talk about that. And that itself can kind of act as a continuing source to groundwater, where the contaminants that are in that free product or NAPL can continue to leach into groundwater as well. Next slide, please. So this timeline was included in the report, and it just lays out specifically the investigation and response action work that MPCA completed at the former Midtown Service Station site. The other part of this timeline that I haven't included in this slide, but is in the report, also shows the actions that were taken in terms of shutting down municipal wells, installing new wells, sort of the water supply actions that were taken when the contamination was investigated. We'll talk a little bit about that today, but I have been asked to really focus on cleanup of the former Midtown Service Station site and the work that was done there. So as you can see, detections of petroleum contamination was first identified here in the city municipal wells in the mid-1980s. A few years later, about 1989, a file was opened at the Midtown Service Station site, and it was started to be looked at as the potential source of that contamination to the city wells. So over a number of years, the MPCA did conduct pretty extensive investigations to determine, how far the contamination, how far it had traveled in groundwater, where it was in relation to the underground storage tanks and things like that. And this is pretty typical for a contaminated site. It does take a number of years, especially at the beginning, to really, you install soil borings, you install groundwater monitoring wells or test pits and things like that, just to really get a handle on what we call the extent of the contamination. Following the investigation attempts and really sort of concurrent with that, the underground storage tanks were removed in late 1989 and early 1990. And at the time of that removal, about 1,500 cubic yards of contaminated soil surrounding the tanks was also removed and disposed of off-site. And that's very typical as well. If a leaky underground storage tank is discovered, that tank is removed along with any contaminated soil surrounding the tank that can be easily excavated and disposed of. So really in the early 1990s and through the 1990s, investigations continued. And then the MPCA did start to look at possible cleanup technologies and doing what we call pilot tests. So small-scale tests to determine if any of these cleanup technologies would be viable or would work at this particular site, depending on soil conditions, depending on groundwater conditions, and things like that. So I, completely understand the city's frustration with decades of investigation, and from what it certainly sounds like, fairly poor communication from the MPCA and Department of Health during that time. So just wanted to, again, this timeline is in our report as well, just to lay out, the years of investigation, the pilot testing and feasibility studies, which I'll talk about as well, to where we are today. And then one other thing that I'll mention, and we'll talk about a little bit in further slides, is that efforts to recover that free product, or NAPL, did begin at the site in 1991, shortly after the contamination was discovered and the tanks were excavated. But I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. Okay, next slide, please. So the MPCA found that the extent of this free product, or LNAPL, was greater than 1 acre at the site, and sort of in the immediate vicinity of the site. And I will say that a summary of these findings is also in the report as well. Benzene in the groundwater, we did find through the file review that the groundwater contamination had migrated approximately 750 feet from the site. Just as groundwater flows, naturally under the ground, this contamination flows with it and migrates away from the initial site or initial source area. And there are a couple of different sand units that we've shown here. So the extent in the lower sand unit was somewhat smaller than in the more shallow sand unit. The edge of that benzene groundwater plume has consistently been greater than 800 feet from the city well field. As Mayor Renke mentioned at the start of this meeting, definitely want to reiterate that the drinking water is safe, and that there are monitoring wells and things like that in place to monitor the plume. Next slide, please. So just a really quick word on risk-based site management, which is what the MPCA and many other pollution control agencies or the Environmental Protection Agency uses to evaluate contaminated sites. Once the site's been investigated and we have a handle on the type of contamination that it is and the extent of the contamination, sort of how much soil or groundwater is impacted, then we start to turn to evaluating cleanup. And cleanup, like I mentioned, is really based on what we call a risk-based management approach. So you have to both have the presence of contaminants and potential exposure pathways. For example, the groundwater being used is being used as a drinking water source, so that there is some potential for, either human or ecological receptors, we say, to be impacted by that contamination. Our report focuses both on preventing exposure to humans, and those are some of the actions that the city took with the municipal wells, where some wells were shut down, new wells were installed without contamination. The VOC plant or air stripper was installed in the event that it was needed to treat the water. Those are what we call kind of exposure prevention methods, and they're very important. But what I wanted to focus on today, because we've been asked to focus on that, is the controlling the source of contamination piece. So what we call the corrective actions or cleanup actions. Both are very important, both play a very big role, and both were evaluated in the BAR report. But I know that this is sometimes kind of a tricky concept. But I did want to focus on what we call source removal actions or corrective actions. So those are actions like excavating contaminated soil, installing an air sparging system that would actually treat the petroleum contaminants in the groundwater underground, a groundwater pump and treat system where groundwater would be pumped above the ground, treated, and then discharged. Free product recovery and removal, which we'll talk about as well. And then monitored natural attenuation, which is a concept that the petroleum contamination actually can degrade under natural processes. The microorganisms that are in the soil or in the groundwater can actually break that down. It takes a long time, it's a long timeline, and there's monitoring that goes along with that. But that is another sort of technology or action that is almost always evaluated, particularly with petroleum contamination, when natural processes can break the contaminants down. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the cleanup actions or source removal actions that MPCA did did complete at the Midtown Service Station site. So as I mentioned, about 1,500 cubic yards of contaminated soil were removed during the tank removal in 1989. And the free product or LNAPL recovery efforts that started in the 1990s and continue, you start to see sort of diminishing returns with that. Yeah.
Charles? Thank you.
Okay. No worries.
Mom's coming.
No worries. You do start to see diminishing returns when you're trying to get that free product sort of out of the groundwater. It's harder to get over time. So while that, you know, from 1994 to 1995, they were able to get about 25 gallons a year in recovery. But in the last few years, they've only been able to get, well, really in the last almost 20 years, oh no, I'm sorry, 12 years, just about a gallon a year. So some of these things are harder to clean up sort of as time goes on. There was a time where City Well 4 was pumped to control migration of the plume. So that groundwater pumping was a corrective action to kind of control the source of contamination. And then monitored natural attenuation is really what MPCA is doing at the former Midtown Service Station site right now. So they are monitoring the groundwater and sort of letting natural processes take its course in terms of breaking down that contamination so it's not an issue. I will talk about some of the feasibility studies or pilot studies that MPCA conducted to take a look at what additional actions could be taken potentially for cleanup, and if those efforts would be feasible, technically feasible and effective, and you know, sort of what the balance was on that. Next slide. Oh yeah, sure.
I got this as a question for Ron. Where is well number 4, just for those who don't know?
Right in the back of City Hall.
Right back at City Hall, okay.
Okay.
And that one, just historically, that was the one, Ron, that was run 24/7 and just pumped into the river for a number of years to draw the plume north rather than towards the new field, right?
That is correct.
Right. So just a word about other cleanup technologies that are out there. Some were evaluated and some pretty extensively by the MPCA specifically for the Midtown Service Station site over the years. So soil vapor extraction, this is a technology where wells are put down into the soil but not into groundwater, and a vacuum is put on those wells, and they actually suck the soil vapor into the pipes and then either treat or discharge that soil vapor, which also is contaminated with petroleum, above ground. And during that pilot testing that was done in 1993, and that was found to be infeasible, mainly because of the conditions of the soil at the site. Groundwater pump and treat was also evaluated in terms of doing some pumping tests at the site, again in 1993, and that was found to be ineffective. And the MPCA did look pretty carefully at additional excavations in the source area. So basically at the Midtown Service Station site itself, they looked at both a large-scale and a small-scale excavation, both still quite a lot of soil to be removed. The large-scale excavation would have resulted in about 15,000 cubic yards of soil to be removed. This would be excavating to a depth of 25 feet, both at the site and in adjacent streets and neighboring residential properties, which of course, you know, this was just something that was looked at. It wasn't, you know, tear these folks' homes down or anything like that. It was just what would it look like if we conducted an excavation to remove all of that free product where we think it is. The smaller scale excavation was 6,500 cubic yards. That would have stayed just on the site itself, so the entire site boundary, again, down to about 25 feet. And, you know, some of the shoring and dewatering that would be associated with that. MPCA did find that even with the small scale excavation that was confined to the site, that would only remove about a third of the product that is out there, and that it would not be effective in reducing the groundwater plume, you know, that had already migrated from the site. In 2011, the agency looked at what we call dual phase extraction, and we have a figure shown of that here from a trade group from ITRC. And that would involve extracting both groundwater and free product where we could, and then treating that above ground as well. And that test was again determined to be not feasible because it was difficult to dewater at the site to lower the groundwater table enough where we could recover enough of the free product. Other potential cleanup technologies that the MPCA did not evaluate as part of their feasibility studies was chemical or biological amendments. This is actually injecting chemicals into the subsurface to really help with those natural degradation processes that I talked about. So it's to sort of help the natural processes along. And air sparging was not evaluated as well. And that involves injecting air into the subsurface to really get the volatiles, the contamination that's in there, where they could be captured by an SVE system and treated above ground as well. Next slide, please. City staff asked us to come up with some very back of the envelope ballpark cost estimates for what some of these other cleanup technologies may cost at the Midtown Service Station site. Again, I just want to reiterate that these are very, you know, what we call back of the envelope, just to give an idea of the scale and things like that. So the small scale excavation option, so 6,500 cubic yards, there's costs associated with excavation and backfill. There's costs associated with disposal of the contaminated materials. And then there'll be annual ongoing groundwater monitoring as well, even after the excavation has been completed. You know, so looking at ballpark, you know, anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million for that smaller scale excavation. The groundwater pump and treat system, again, some of these technologies were determined that they would not be effective at this site, but we still wanted to, you know, provide some context for what those technologies might look like. Some pretty significant capital costs, some annual, what we call operations and maintenance costs, which would continue ongoing groundwater monitoring as well. And pump and treat systems are notorious for, you know, if you start one, you're going to be running it for a long time. And then some of the other costs are shown here as well. Again, just to give folks an idea of the scale of if these technologies were determined to be feasible, you know, ballpark, what kind of cost would be looked at. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to reiterate again the recommendations for Paynesville that were in the ENRT report. Really, we were focused on expanding the Sentinel well network, We didn't talk a lot about that in this presentation because we were asked to kind of focus on cleanup of the Midtown Service Station site. But we did have a few recommendations in our report to expand the Sentinel Well network, document that, and then, what are the response actions if contamination is discovered in the Sentinel wells that are located there. Next slide, please. Just a few other considerations or things that city staff had communicated to us may be of interest to this group. I really strongly would recommend that the city request improved and more frequent communications with MPCA and MDH. As I mentioned, I completely understand the frustration that you all must have felt over the years as this issue has impacted your community. I think requesting that, really, making a strong case for that. How are they going to take the recommendations that were in the ENRT report? Can we have better communication and coordination around sampling of the Sentinel well network and things like that? And the MPCA actually owns the former Midtown Service Station site. What are their plans for that? And the city staff had mentioned to us that future use and redevelopment of the site might be something that this group was interested in hearing about. Again, that was not the focus of our report and of our study. But I think talking to MPCA about, they own the site, which is quite unusual. They probably don't want to own it. But including that in any communications with MPCA, if the city has a desire to see that site redeveloped. And just a very quick note that there are brownfield redevelopment grants and loans available, both from the state and US EPA. That funding is competitive, and the strongest applications typically do have a development plan associated with that application. And I think that's all I've got.
All right. I'll open it up for questions, but I have a list in front of me, so if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
You talked about how you got a number of records from the MPCA. I'm wondering what types of records those were. And did you get like everything Paynesville related or just certain things?
We made our request through the Freedom of Information Act request. This is very typical. The MPCA and Department of Health deal with these requests all the time. So we made that request and the files were provided to us. So I cannot speak to what was provided and what was not, but we sort of went through that official channel and reviewed all of the documents that we were provided. And I'll let Sheridan correct me if I'm wrong about the types of documents that were included. But investigation work plans, investigation reports, annual monitoring reports, probably for every year, that included groundwater data. Some of the feasibility studies or corrective action design reports that we referenced in the report. So those reports where they would be looking at different remedial technologies, those were provided to us as well. As well as, if I'm remembering correctly, we almost always get like a communications folder. So there would be emails and correspondence, I think between both MPCA, Department of Health, and likely with city officials too, right, Sheridan?
Yeah, there wasn't as much of the communications, but there were some emails between the city staff and the NPCA, as well as internal communications where hydrogeologists had reviewed some of the annual monitoring reports and either concurred with the findings or, expressed other ideas for the consultant to take another look at.
Okay. On that, with the FOIA request, were there any things that you requested but didn't get?
There were not, that I recall, specific reports that we never received, there were a few, sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to jump.
Please do.
But I made the request, so, there was a couple reports that we had to specifically go back to the MPCA and say, hey, we noticed this report was referenced in another report and it wasn't initially provided. Can you please provide that? And then we received it. And I think a lot of that comes down to just, this dates back to 1985. A lot of the files are paper. And so it was a matter of getting a scanned copy and sending that over to us.
So at the end of the day, you got what you had asked for, and throughout the process, there were additional things that you knew to ask about, and then you got those. Okay. What non-MPCA documents did you utilize in generating the report?
I believe that we did get some data from Minnesota Department of Health, mainly, and when I say data, I should say analytical data from sampling that they would have done on the municipal wells specifically, not on the monitoring wells at the site. That's kind of MPCA's purview, but MDH is sort of in charge of the drinking water supplies for the state. So I believe that was probably it, right, Sheridan?
No, so we got the MDH data, and then we also had the city's wellhead protection plan. We looked at files for, again, MPCA files, but files for some other sites in the area. And also, there was a couple presentations, I think past city council presentations actually about like the VOC treatment plant, things like that.
Okay. Did BAR conduct any or hire out anyone to do independent soil testing?
No, that was not in the scope of the study. The scope of the study was a desktop third-party review.
I think the answer then is going to be the same, but I'll ask it.
Sure.
So were any of the nearby homeowners interviewed or anything like that?
Nope, we did, I should have mentioned this, we did meet with city staff. I know Sheridan, you were part of that tour, and I think met with Ron and Chuck. Yep.
All right. And the reason why I bring that up is there have been anecdotal reports of like residents who might smell gas fumes at certain times of the year with the freeze-thaw cycle, and whether or not that might have affected your conclusions at all if you had known that.
Right.
Do you have any idea if it may have affected anything?
That's a really great question, Mayor Ranke. However, like I mentioned, the scope of our report was very focused on drinking water.
Okay.
We definitely noticed, as we're reviewing in the reports, that vapor intrusion, is of potential concern. And Sheridan, I can't remember if there had been some sampling done.
There's been some sampling, and there's at least one home with a vapor mitigation system. I think
Right.
it's just the one.
Right. But we were because of the scope of the work plan and of the grant, was very focused on drinking water and petroleum contamination. We were very focused on that. Some of the other cities have contaminants other than petroleum in their water supply, and we acknowledge that in the report, but that was not part of the scope of the report.
In terms of like the MPCA feasibility studies that you reviewed, were there any feasibility studies that BAR did on its own?
No.
Is that again because of the scope of it, or?
Yes, that's the scope of yep, due to the scope of the report.
So the MPCA back in '09, if I understand it right, identified the small site excavation or a large site. With 30 years of rainwater mitigation, would there be any point in us even considering a small site excavation at this point?
Again, that's a great question. It's a little bit out of scope again. However, excavations of that scale are never easy, and they're expensive. There are other risks associated with having an excavation of that size open as well. One other thing that I maybe touched on a bit, but that, you know, I think is good for this group to keep in mind, is that you can clean up the source, you know, as best you can, but we also have the groundwater plume that's migrated off-site to deal with. So a lot of the cleanup technologies that I spoke about, you know, would be applied to one or both, sort of the source area or the site itself, and the groundwater plume that's migrated off-site. I mean, again, BAR did not conduct our own feasibility studies at Paynesville or any of the other 3 cities. That wasn't sort of the scope of the report that we were tasked with. You know, however, we did review MPCA's feasibility studies that they completed, and we did agree, you know, with their findings, so that they looked at these excavations, they determined that they would be technically infeasible. I mean, they could be done, but the small-scale excavation, for example, there's still a lot of free product that's outside of the site boundaries, unfortunately. So you could remove everything, or try to get everything that you can within the site, under very difficult dewatering conditions as well. But there would still be contamination remaining outside of the site, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's why I'm asking specifically about like the excavation, because it's easy to think about, well, let's just go dig it up and mitigate that. And that's why I want to make sure that we're clear on why that might not necessarily be totally feasible.
Right.
So I guess, you know, the small scale as identified by MPCA was 6,500 cubic yards, which as I understood you to say was just the site.
Yes.
So if the 15,500 was sufficient in 2009, with the plume continuing to move, are there any estimates on what a large size excavation might be today?
Right, well, and that excavation is really to just address that area where there is free product. So it doesn't address like where the benzene plume has migrated off-site. It's unlikely that that area of free product has changed or changed by much. But certainly the groundwater plume, you know, may continue to migrate. It may be biodegrading sort of as it goes. But I wouldn't expect the free product sort of area to change much. Is that right, Sheridan? Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that about the free product, but also want to add that from the monitoring that the NPCA's consultant has done, they have found the plume currently is stable. So while if pumping was increased or something like that, or other conditions change, that plume could continue to migrate. Right now, they found that it's stable and it's not migrating.
Okay. Knowing that this oversimplifies everything, the solution to pollution is dilution. So how much rainwater needs to fall before we say the free product is just not a problem anymore? It's just been so diluted out into the plume that we don't need to care.
Well, free product is a little bit of a different animal from the dissolved, I'm sorry, I hate to use all these technical terms, from the dissolved contamination in the benzene plume. And that's a very good question. That is, you know, part of what happens is infiltration and the degradation processes. You know, I could not answer that question off the top of my head. But it is a very long timeline, this monitored natural attenuation process. It takes a while for these contaminants to break down. They do break down, but it does take a while.
Okay. I'm getting to the end, I promise. Based on the study and the reports that you reviewed, we're not currently operating the VOC plant. It's not there, so we're not spending the money on it. Does BAR have an opinion on whether or not we will ever need to?
again, that was outside of the scope of the report. And I'm not a hydrogeologist, I'm not a groundwater modeler. But we do know that as of right now, as we've talked about, that the drinking water is safe, and that there is the Sentinel monitoring network that we've talked about, that we've recommended that MPCA expand, that is a way, sort of an early alarm system to let the city know, if and when the airstrip or VOC plant's needed.
So I said at the beginning, part of this is learning what questions to ask. Is that then something the city might want to consider doing, is getting some ground model sampling done? For example, we had a business looking at coming to town a few years ago that was going to be pumping hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. And just to get an idea then of how that might affect the plume and how that might go. Is that something that we should look at having in our sort of toolbox?
I do think that if a new sort of, groundwater user or groundwater, an entity that wants to pump groundwater near this plume, that would be something to look at, certainly. And I think making MPCA and Department of Health aware of that as well.
Last question that I have for you, the full report and all of the documents that you reviewed, everything that went into making your report, like, can we get a copy of your file? Or if somebody wanted a copy of your file, could we get it from you to give to them? Is that all public information?
The report itself is public information, and I don't think we really have anything in terms of the records that were provided to us by MPCA. They could be requested from MPCA as well.
Yeah.
Okay. And because, again, going back to everything you got was MPCA, Department of Health, therefore everything could be received from them. And
Right,
then
or the city, like Sheridan mentioned, yep.
Okay. All right. Council? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, anybody from the committees?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
In your report that one of the main contaminants that have been worried about in the area is benzene, but it doesn't show that there are any trace amounts of benzene, even to the smallest amount recordable. However, I brought up during our meeting that we reject this report because benzene was not reported, where there should have been a report in there. Mainly because, from when I looked up the federal level of parts per billion is 5 parts per billion, Minnesota level is 2 parts per billion. Okay, and I guess we'll have to accept that part. When it comes to an adult, I'm gonna use a figure of a 190-pound adult, and if they get 2 parts per billion, if you get a 19-pound toddler at 2 parts per billion, they're getting 10 times the amount of benzene. Even if it's a trace amount, that's still 4 times the federal level. So there are, if we're drinking an 8-ounce glass of water that has just a trace amount of benzene that's not reported, a toddler or an infant that's drinking an 8-ounce bottle of formula may be getting 3 to 4 times the amount of benzene in their system. And we all know what benzene, I mean, for those who don't know what benzene does, it's a big contributor to blood diseases, increased platelets, leukemia, and that's why I think that this report is unintentionally biased, because it does not treat the whole population. It treats just the adults in the area, where there are people, children, infants, that this is going to affect greater. And this is where I think, well, I can make a recommendation later on, but I just wanted to make that very important, that I think we need to address this issue. Because I know there isn't any parents out there who are going to freely give their kids this water it's not reported with benzene, but there's a very slight chance there could be some.
Is there any concern that there's benzene in the drinking water? that we're currently running out of our tap
No, not to my
at
knowledge,
any level?
not at
That might be harmful.
reportable levels, yep.
I'm just
And
wondering why that wasn't reported then. It was not in the report, that the benzene level, there was no detection in it.
Well, it said it's below HRL,
Yeah.
health risk limit, which is 2 parts per billion, but it doesn't say it was 1.5. That makes it safe. I remember when George W. Bush changed how much arsenic HRL should be in people's water. Good God, I don't want any. And we shouldn't have any benzene in our water, no matter how.
And imagine what that would do to a newborn.
I agree with you 100%.
So that's why I think that this stuff should get reported down to the level of it's going to affect everybody, not just the average person.
You're using four wells right now, and well 8 is pumping 2/3 of the water we're drinking. That means the other third has trace amounts of benzene. All, according to the government or according to the pollution control, it's below the limits that they say are safe, but there's still benzene in it.
Well,
That's durable.
Safe for who?
I think with any chemical, it's not the chemical itself, it's the dose. Water can be poisonous at certain amounts. You drink too much water, you're going to get sick. So I guess the question is, if there are concerns that the Minnesota Department of Health or the FDA has set safety limits too high, are there things that the city can do to get more exact levels of the contamination that's in our water? Are there labs that we can contact that can go down to, I don't know, the 1 part per billion or the half a part per billion? Like, how specific can we get if we wanted to do that?
I'd have to look back at the report, but I think the benzene was reported to 1 or half a microgram per liter, which is a part per billion. So the Minnesota health risk limit is 2, like you said. The federal is 5, so the federal is less conservative than Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And your reporting limit is lower still than that and says that there's no benzene in the drinking water. So down to the reporting limit, which is below the health risk limit, it's not present. As far as risk to a toddler versus an adult, I'm not a risk assessor, but I think from what little I do know, the entire population is considered, including children.
That part I have to disagree with, because when you go to the doctor and they take your height and your weight, they determine your total body mass. An adult's not going to get the same dose, an infant's not going to get the same dose as an adult. So the total body mass that the infant has is, when they ingest this chemical, is going to be a lot more dangerous and harmful to an infant or a toddler than it is an adult.
Right, but
Yep.
I think when they set the limits, they consider.
They consider different ages, different, again, like Sheridan said, we aren't toxicologists, we aren't risk assessors. But the Department of Health and EPA set those values, I believe, considering, the range of population, including infants and toddlers and pregnant women and things like that too.
So right after I moved to Painesville in 1999, a year later, my daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. And she was only 2 years old at the time and about maybe 15 pounds. Did this contribute to it? I have no idea. It sure didn't help it. But, is there another parent out there that has to worry about this stuff? Hopefully not now. But what we need to do is figure out if this is ever going to happen again, which is why we need to address this and hopefully take care of the problem that should have been taken care of 40 years ago, which is completely take out that whole area and let nature take its course afterwards, instead of trying to kick the can down the road here and keep having these meetings where there's a lot of talking and not a whole lot of action.
Paul, I don't understand the concern. There's no detectable benzene in our drinking water today. It has historically been detected, but it's not there today. Why are we scaring everyone with what you're saying right now?
I'm not scaring them, I'm alerting them to be aware of it.
That's why we have the VOC plant. I understand that we are here to talk about going forward.
Yes.
But when we're talking about should people give their kids water to drink, our water today is perfectly safe.
I agree.
And to say otherwise, you're scaring the shit out of people for no reason.
From 20 years ago.
From 20 years ago, we're not 20 years ago.
Okay, so why?
So why are we scaring people into saying, don't drink the water? We are not Flint, Michigan. Our water is safe to drink. And if there's a problem, we have the VOC plant to treat it.
Then let's get rid of the source.
And that's a good thing that we're talking about.
Okay, then let's move forward with that.
We need to be, like, this cannot be overstated. Our water is safe
I
to
know.
drink. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from, okay. Mark, did you want to?
I don't know if I can, what I can do after that, but all right. Hello, it's great to be back.
And I saw you writing down some of my questions. If you hit on them while you're talking, I'll try not to ask you at the end. I think you know there were some that were going to go both ways.
I kind of figured that. I kind of had a thing here. I got a bunch of stuff written down. Sarah's presentation was actually very good, so I may wander a bit here and there, but I'll try to hit the high points. So anyways, I think everybody knows who I am. Just as a summary, in 2014, all of the groundwater scientists that I work with in the petroleum program got together and decided that our policy for cleanup, actually not cleanup, of sites was flawed, fatally flawed. And since our manager was Michael Canner and he would not listen to anybody, we decided to file a complaint with upper management, a formal complaint, which we did. I was sort of ringleader of the show by default, but when our division director asked me to provide an example of a site where human health was not adequately being protected, where we weren't cleaning up things that legally we were required to clean up, I mentioned Paynesville. And as I like to say, my life's changed all of a sudden right after that, but that's neither here nor there. So anyways, part of the problem I see here is that the MPCA really is ignoring rural issues here in favor of what's going on in the metro area. And I'll just give you a quick example of that. The PFAS issue, the 3M chemical issue in the East Metro area, go to the MPCA's website. You can download a map, you can look at wells, you can see all the sampling data they've done, there's summaries of what they're doing out there. Do that for Paynesville, and you'll get a one-page printout, and a lot of that information is actually wrong, even to this day. So that was one of my biggest fears here, was that, okay, why are we not dealing with these issues? So in some respects, it's kind of like Flint, Michigan. I mean, it isn't nearly the scale of Flint, Michigan, but it's the same thing where the state is actively denying and dismissing their own scientists that are saying, hey, there's a problem out here, we need to deal with it. And unfortunately, I took the brunt of most of that, but that's just the way it is. So despite investigating your city for 37 years or 40 years or how many years it was, the state's been looking at this. They still can't tell you, and you kind of asked the question earlier, how long is this contamination going to last? Well, it's been here for at least 50 years. This is leaded gasoline. They stopped using it in the mid-1970s. The station's been around for 87 years. So that contamination is widespread, and as huge as that area is right now, hasn't really degraded much in the past 50 to 80 years. So the question is, well, how much longer is it going to be there? Well, at least 50, 100, 200 years? I don't know. I'm guessing 200 years. But that's just my guess. We don't really know. But the problem is it's just not going away. So this is going to be a problem no matter what happens out there unless you clean it up. Another thing, too, you kind of mentioned about sampling. the NPCA and the Department of Health only samples for about a dozen petroleum chemicals. And there are thousands of petroleum chemicals out there. Now, I don't want to, alarm you guys, but most of the chemicals that you would find, they're sampling for right now. But we actually did a study in Paynesville. I got some funding from the United States Geological Survey to look at petroleum degradation products. So what happens is petroleum breaks down into other things before it completely goes away. And what we found at a site that we were doing research on in Bemidji was that these petroleum degradation compounds travel about twice as far as the known extent of the groundwater plume. So the jury's still kind of out on if there's any health effects from it, but in my opinion, I wouldn't want to be drinking any petroleum degradation compounds, and they're definitely present in your aquifer. Whether they're present in your well or not, we weren't able to ascertain just because the study was not done very well. Another thing too, Sarah talked about plumes. So you've got the gasoline in the ground, the free product or LNAPL that she talked about. That's the source, and then the plume comes off of that. A good analogy is a fire. The gasoline is the fire. The plume is the smoke. What happens when you put out the fire? Well, the smoke quickly dissipates. So I don't worry so much about plumes. I mean, if they're impacting somebody, yes, I will worry about it then. I worry about getting rid of that source area or making it as small as possible so the plume, the smoke cloud, is as little as possible, and therefore the rest of the fire is going to quickly, dissipate. So the smaller you make it, whatever you do, if you can get the source area down as small as possible, it will attenuate faster. The reason why it's lasted for 80 years is because it's such a huge area. So kind of what happened was that the NPCA, so a 750-foot long petroleum plume is actually quite long for a gas station. I've seen longer plumes at obviously larger sites. I've worked with BAR for my entire career at the NPCA. I worked with them quite closely. They were actually quite valuable in helping us clean up some of the worst contaminated sites in the state, one of those being Flint Hills Refinery. They've been innovative, and they've been very successful at, with my help as a state regulator, to get sites cleaned up. We removed over 7 million gallons of product from beneath the Flint Hills Refinery. There is no way we can't clean up this site. Without a doubt. I don't have any, problem with that. Because we're dealing with leaded gasoline, this is the kicker. This was the kicker of my lawsuit, and this is the kicker of everything I've been doing. It's like, because it's leaded gasoline, it contains additives that are not biodegradable. You can't use monitored natural attenuation at a site with non-biodegradable compounds. It's not permitted by state law. So the PCA is actually violating its own laws by saying that we're not going to clean up the site, we're going to rely on natural attenuation. But the problem for them is there's 5,000 of these sites that they inadvertently, or not inadvertently, purposefully not cleaned up. So if they have to clean up Paynesville, oh my God, what's that going to say about Alexandria? What's that going to say about everything else? I was brought into the petroleum program from a sister program in like 2012, I think it was. And my job was, because I had worked on Flint Hills and some other sites, I've done a really good job, kind of become the de facto remediation expert at the agency, was to deal with some of these sites. So my first site I was given was Blaine. Blaine municipal wells had high levels of leaded gasoline additives in it, and my job was to find the source of it. Well, it took me about 2 weeks to find it. It was a bus garage. Had at least as big a footprint as this site. We dug it all up. I think it was, I don't know how many thousands of cubic yards we dug out, but it was big. It cost $700,000, and it was highly successful. So we did that one. The problem is, it takes a while for that plume, the smoke, to dissipate, and that's what's occurring at Blaine right now. The levels are just finally starting to drop at their municipal wells. They have a treatment plant, just like you do too, that they installed because of this. cleanup technology has really changed dramatically in the last 15 years. So all the work that the PCA claims they did on feasibility studies isn't really applicable anymore. There's some new stuff we can do now that is actually it's been done quite successfully before. But I want to reiterate, and I think you guys know this, that the NPCA's contractor was incompetent. They installed the wells incorrectly, which is why the multi-phase extraction system pilot study failed. It was all written down by Paul Stock in NPCA remarks. And another word, NPCA, if you do a FOIA request to the NPCA and say, send me the entire file, you will not get everything they have. I know that for a fact because I've done it myself, and I know what they have. So there are these staff remarks, there are emails between staff that you will not get if you do a FOIA request. So if you're looking for the rest of the information, you have to know what to ask for, and you have to be quite forceful with the agency to get them to give it to you, because they're not going to give it to you. I have it because I took it with me when I left the agency. So that's how I've given you guys some that stuff, especially the staff remarks that show Paul Stock complaining that the contractor they did screwed up the pilot study. And also, if you read it too, every single technical expert that wrote remarks over the last 30 years in the NPCA's computer system said we should just clean up the site and get it over with. But NPCA management kept saying no. Why? Because, well, one, it costs money, and two, because, they had this policy of we'll just take care of the well. We don't have to worry about the contamination. But interestingly enough, I filed a complaint with the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor. In 2022, when you go read the report online, they slammed the NPCA for not considering the future risk, which is risk, all risk is actually future risk, but to emphasize it, it's future risk. They slammed the NPCA for not considering what happens down the road with a place like Paynesville where, a new industry comes in, and all of a sudden now your groundwater rates have gone up. You're pumping more water. You're pulling things in closer. What happens if you pave an area or don't pave an area, or, there's just so many things that could happen, and who can predict what can happen next year, let alone 100 or 200 years from now? So that's why the NPCA needs to consider that. Every other program at the agency does this except the petroleum program. It's important to note, the same laws and rules that the NPCA used in the 3M lawsuit apply here. There's no difference. So whatever they're making 3M do at that in the East Metro area, it's pretty clear that they should do it here too. The only exception is this biodegradation clause that says it was put in I think the late 1980s. The legislature put in a clause in the petroleum tank rules that said that natural bioremediation shall be used at low-risk sites. In other words, high-risk sites should not be used, they should be cleaned up. But they put that in there specifically because it was sort of new technology at the time and we needed to kind of get costs under control. So they're saying Paynesville is a low-risk site. They're saying Alexandria is a low-risk site. Foley, they're saying all these sites. So what is a high-risk site? Well, they don't know. I mean, I can't think of a higher-risk site than this one. Your drinking water aquifer is contaminated. Your wells might not be contaminated, but they could be someday. So if you have a drinking water aquifer, a public resource, water supply that you're going to rely on for as long as you guys are going to be around, hundreds of years, it's contaminated. It should be cleaned up. It can be cleaned up. So the good news is you can get the site cleaned up for free. The NPCA, because there's no responsible party anymore, has assumed the role of a responsible party. There are costs involved, but there's funding. There's a 2-cent per gallon tax on gasoline that funds the entire NPCA petroleum program. For normal gas station owners or whatnot, they get up to 90% reimbursement, up to $1 million. It's sort of an insurance for them. However, when the state takes over a site, obviously they get funded 100%, and there's no cap on the amount. So my main concern with this report was that it relied on continuing to do monitoring and spend more money on monitoring. We've already spent $2.5 million on monitoring the site and haven't cleaned up a stitch of contamination. How much more money do you want to spend? $25,000 more a year for 100, 200 years? How much is that? So I'm here to say that I can help you get the MPCA to clean up this site for free. The MPCA, I know they're listening, they will be listening, but thing they fear the most is publicity and public concern. Obviously, you guys have all of that going for you. Plus, you have the legal aspects, which haven't even been tested yet. They're not going to want this to get any bigger or anything like that. Even for $1 million or $2 million, they'll just clean up the site. But you have to push the issue, and I would suggest getting your elected representatives involved. I would suggest meeting with the MPCA commissioner, not anybody lower, but the commissioner, and ask her why your drinking water is less important than what's going on in the East Metro area. It's all possible, it's easy, and I don't think it'll cost you a whole lot other than maybe a few letters and some meetings, but, I can help you with that. I can help you get additional information from the agency that they're not going to provide you. I'm willing to help because, it was the right thing to do. I don't regret what I did one bit when I was at the agency. I don't regret filing the lawsuit, but, I had to do what I had to do. So I guess as much rambling as I can do. That's all I got.
Danielle has the first question. This spill is 35 years old, 40 years old almost. The plume, do you have any idea how big the plume is? No, probably not. But we know that plume, the site of that buried gas tank has 100% gasoline soaked into the dirt. 10 feet away, it's 99%. 20 feet away, it's 98%. Once it gets out the end of that plume, it's still got too much benzene in it, but it's, maybe it's 50, who knows. But I haven't had any clue how big that section that you think could be cleaned out, which after 30, 40 years, it could be as big as a city underneath us.
So we actually have a technology now that we didn't have back when all this work was done. It's called LIF, laser-induced fluorescence. It's a really cool device. Probe goes down, shoots a laser, and just by the grace of God, gasoline fluoresces under ultraviolet light where nothing else doesn't. So they can go down and they can measure how much the actual free-phase gasoline, not the dissolved stuff, but the actual free-phase gasoline. And I believe they did that for this site. It's easy enough to do again. It's really quick. And you can do that site in half a day. And it gives you a perfect picture of where the source area is, and that's what you want to target, just the source area. The plume is already there. It's already migrated off site. Cut it off at the head. Let it dissipate on its own. Might take 4 or 5 years, but then it's gone forever. So that's kind of the way that I would approach this site.
So Mark, you just said that the plume has already migrated off-site, and that brings back kind of the question that I asked earlier, which is, because of that, is there any sense in still doing a small site excavation? Or is it all gone from there already?
Whatever you do is better than doing nothing. So kind of the idea is to you want to knock down the amount of, because all this petroleum in there, so what happens is that rainwater falls in, and rainwater contains oxygen from the air, and that's what degrades the petroleum the most. The flux, the amount of oxygen getting into this aquifer is so low that you got this huge plume. It's going to take, it's like trying to dissolve a tanker truck full of hard candy versus a small drop of candy in a drop of water, all right? The more you can knock it down, the quicker it's going to, on its own, rapidly increase its degradation rate and get rid of itself. But it needs help, and it's just not going to happen on its own. That's why it's going to be around for hundreds of years the way it is now. That's why it's been around for 80 years.
You talked about the petroleum degradation compounds, and I might be oversimplifying this in my head, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But the way I understood it from you is it's kind of like where we're at with microplastics. We know that these petroleum degradation compounds exist. We know that microplastics exist. We sort of think they're bad, but we're not really 100% sure. Is that, am I kind of equating, am I understanding what you said correctly, or have there been studies on these degraded compounds that actually show that there is a harm?
There's doing studies depending on who does the study. So the petroleum industry does a study, there's no harm. Some of the university researchers do a study, there's like some chance of a harm. My whole point of that was that you shouldn't have a petroleum contamination in a drinking water aquifer, period. You should just get rid of it because there's so many other things that can go wrong, and who knows what they'll find in the future. I mean, these drinking water HRL rates keep going down. And then benzene isn't the worst one. The worst one is ethylene dibromide, which is a lead gasoline additive. That's 0.0004. So 40 parts per trillion is the HRL for that. We can't even measure that low. So when they say that your drinking water is clean, there's nothing there, we can't, it's to the level that we can measure to, but the actual drinking water standard's down here. The good news about that compound is it's usually not the one you see at leaded gasoline sites. It's the 1,2-dichloroethane, or DCA, which has a HRL of 1. But the typical detection limit is 0.5. So you won't really see it until you see it. And when you see it, it's going to be really close to the drinking water standard. And yes, and yes, there are other methods you can use to get to a lower level, but they're expensive and the state doesn't always employ them.
And I get that, and I realize that for some of these more expensive things, the city's gonna have to discuss whether or not we just foot the bill.
Oh, no, you can force the state to do it.
So,
you don't have to foot the bill. Don't think you guys gotta foot the bill for anything.
there was talk earlier about the plume is stable under current conditions, and I guess I'm curious because you are a hydrogeologist, right?
Correct.
Okay, so do you agree that under current conditions, the plume appears stable?
Yes, but our understanding of stability has changed quite a bit. So what is stable? I mean, that's another question the MPCA has to define too. If it does this, it goes out, comes back, goes out, comes back, is that stable? Or is it, if it just keeps moving, is it unstable? Every plume has a point of stability, and it's based on current conditions. So last year, there's a drought going on. So we didn't have a lot of water infiltrating. Groundwater flow rates were probably lower. The plume probably shrunk. I mean, we don't have enough, we can never have enough monitoring wells to show these things. That's the problem. Monitoring wells are horrendous for monitoring plumes. This year, we have an oversupply of water, and too much rainwater. So now we probably have a plume that's moved a little bit. But stability is just a snapshot in time. That's all it is. And for the MPCA or anybody to say that it's stable today, it'll be stable tomorrow is completely false thinking, because that's not going to be the case. Too many things can change. Like I said, you guys can increase your pumping rate. Another problem is too, someday you guys might want to put in a new well. Well, guess what? You can't put the well where you want to put the well, which is closest to your water treatment plant or your distribution system. You're going to have to put it a ways outside town. And who's going to pay for that? That's one thing you guys are going to have to pay for. But if they cleaned up that site, you wouldn't have to worry about that. That's been a problem with other municipalities too. They had to move their drinking water supply away from town. This is what Foley did. I think they moved it a mile away from town just to get it away from the contaminated area. And then the state said, well, it's moved. We don't have to clean it up.
Based on, the variety of cleanup methods, do you have a suggested approach?
For a site like this, I think air sparging, soil vapor extraction, which was never evaluated. I don't know if it was evaluated, but it was never pilot tested. That's one of my favorites. Basically, what you do is you taking a straw and sticking it in a soda pop and blowing bubbles, and then all the carbonation comes out. Well, the carbonation would be the contamination in groundwater. But then you have a soil vapor extraction system, SVE, basically a big vacuum cleaner that sucks the vapors that come out of the water, and then you could usually you have to treat it somehow because it'll be high concentrations, but that also adds oxygen to the groundwater, which also degrades the compounds. It also, if you do it properly, it kind of mixes the groundwater and gets things moving once again. I mean, all the talk about trying to remove the petroleum product, the LNAPL, out of, Sarah had some figures, it was like 1 gallon last year. That technology was something we were looking at in the 1980s. We don't do that anymore. That does not work. I mean, it seems feasible. Well, if I just put a pump in the well and pump out the gasoline, it'll all come out, and that's not how it works, unfortunately.
Those are the questions that I had. Looking around at the rest of the council or committee.
I guess it'd be Ron or Chuck. We quit the stripper, wasn't that causing our filtration problems? Or what was the deal there?
Do you want to answer?
Well, I think it was without the it was causing some issues with the filters because there wasn't the presence of it wasn't really treating any of the benzene in the water, so it was changing some characteristics and forming some,
The calcium magnesium were coming out of the water. It was doing the job of actually a softener. And so our hardness was coming out, and that was creating issues. So the solution to that was to add sulfuric acid to the water, which would tie it up, so to speak.
Very expensive.
Very expensive, yes.
So that's why we aren't using the stripper until we absolutely need to. And then there's more cost and other problems.
Yeah, the state spent over $5 million on this small town, which is a significant chunk of money, and they really haven't done much for reducing your risk or cleaning up the contamination.
Do you think we're gonna have to turn that chemical plant back on?
Well, it depends, you're going to get more industry in town, it's going to use more water. If you use more water, it's definitely going to pull that contamination towards those wells. There is no doubt about that. I mean, the reason you mentioned, you ran a old well that was contaminated for years and just dumped the water. Well, one, that's a waste of water. Two, it's a waste of energy. And three, why didn't we just clean up the site and not have to do that?
And what they pumped out eventually filled back up again anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was a perfectly good well. They just got impacted by the site and the
Well,
state's.
it sounds like you're doing the right thing. I mean, you've got 4 wells that are showing clear now, safe now. Cleaning up, I think, is a little too late to start because it's dissipated. It was horrible at first, but if you dig all that ground up and get that all out of there 40 years ago, that's one thing. But to try to start now when that plume is all dissipating, just drill. Well, it's going to. You're never going to get it all out of there. It's huge. And so digging another well. I mean, we all know that you could dig a well 300 feet deep. You can dig one 600 feet deep. It's different water aquifer. And so you've done that. You found aquifers that are clean, clear, and if it's stable, this plume is stable now, it's because there's probably clay sections or layers of clay down there that trap it. And that might stay that way forever. But there's no easy solution. But you're doing the right thing. You've made new wells until you've got clean wells.
But we are growing as a city, and there are some industries coming in. The water usage is going to go up.
Just don't get an
So-
alcohol plant.
You know, it might be good today, a year from now it could be very different.
Yeah, I understand.
Especially if we go through another drought and the plume shrinks, it's gonna pull it in even quicker.
I mean, I guess that was, the business that I was alluding to, Mark, earlier is the one that you were advising on.
Yeah,
And, they were looking at 30% of our daily supply, if I recall their numbers right, for water, that they were going to add to?
I think it was close to that.
No? Was 15?
15.
Okay, for tonight's rough number is 15% of what we're currently pumping. And I understand that conditions can change depending on drought or flood conditions, things like that. But, I mean, a single user coming in that's adding 15% onto our water usage, could that alone change the stability of the plume and shift where it's going?
Oh, for sure. And, you know, you guys kind of got a decision to make. If you want to do something, now's the time. If you accept this report and just go home, the MPCA is going to do the same, and that site will sit there being an eyesore. And if the state owns it, they're not going to redevelop it. It's going to be an eyesore for your lives, your kids' lives, and their grandkids' lives. Because as far as, you know, Forever Chemicals get all the publicity, but you know what? That contamination there to everyone living today in this room or born today, that's a forever chemical too. Those sites, that stuff's going to be there for our lifetimes and even our kids' lifetime and grandkids' lifetime. So why are we worried about, you know, paying more attention to what's going on in the East Metro area versus sites like this?
And I like what Mark says, if we can get the MPCA to pay for trying to.
Hey, we did it for Blaine. And to be honest with you, out of the, by gosh or by jolly, I don't know how I managed to get them to do that, but they did it. So they did it for Blaine, and it was a big project too. They could do it for here too, they just have to decide. Their big fear is that one, they'll have to admit that everything they've been saying all along is wrong, and two, this can lead other small towns like yours to ask the same question. Hey, why did you not clean up this contamination in our drinking water aquifer?
Sarah?
I will just note that Blaine continues to operate their air stripper and likely will for some time. Just wanted to add that context.
Which is the VOC treatment.
Along with
Yes.
the.
Yeah.
So, and it's probably in your report, I didn't focus on what was going on in Blaine. Forgive me for not caring as much.
Understandably, yeah.
Hey.
Are they actually treating chemicals with their VOC stripper right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mentioned that earlier, and I did note that the levels are starting to drop there now.
Right.
But it's gonna take time. It's a different scenario. That site is a mile away from their municipal well or so.
My biggest concern, and it's one that I had before the last time this council discussed it, and it was shared by our city attorney, which is just if I'm anyone making a decision at MPCA, I look at this and I go, hey, Painesville, you went to the legislature, you got funding for an independent study. The independent study that you begged and fought us for came back and said we did everything fine. So hail to the no, are we gonna pay anything more above and beyond what we've already done? And maybe, I mean, if the reliance on the MNA is in violation of state law, that might be a legislature or a judicial action that we could take to try and challenge that. But I keep trying to put myself in the position of the MPCA, and I keep coming back and saying, you petulant child, you got what you asked for, now go away. And that's, right, wrong, or otherwise, that's, if I'm an MPCA commissioner, that's what I would say.
So in all fairness to Barr, who did the report, the legislature wrote that, they basically took the language right out of the four cities were in my lawsuit. That's how those four cities got named. They didn't give very clear instructions.
No.
So, I mean, and as we've already discussed, and Barr has shown you that your plume is currently stable. That's true. But, like I said, the state legislative auditor slammed the NPCA for not considering future development in their risk decisions in the petroleum program, like they do all the other programs. So therefore, you know, that's kind of the comeback to saying, well, yeah, the plume is stable, and as long as you guys just, you know, if you just want to freeze everything right now and don't change a thing for the next 200 years, you're good.
I got a question. If the city decides to act with MPCA, what kind of time frame before you can expect even a response from them? Is this if they would decide to excavate the site?
Well, it
I
depends.
have an
Near
answer.
future, 5 years down the road?
I have a rough answer on that because it's something that Mark talked about earlier. Mark said the MPCA fears publicity. Get this out there, they'll be listening to us tonight. Yeah, they will. And I know they will because Ron Mergen got an email earlier today in response
Everybody's
to,
watching.
Oh, really?
in response to a question about testing reports and other things. And that email just said, I told Ron that I would share it with everyone here. They shared information that Sarah included in the report about the Brownfields program as well. Provided the 2023 and 2024 reports, along with some information about how HRLs are developed and things like that. So that is something that, we got. I don't know, Ron, when you reached out for that information, but conveniently the response came a few hours ago.
So it's something that could be moving along fairly rapidly.
Yeah, I mean,
I
my
know
guess,
government isn't fast, I realize that. But are we talking 5 years, we don't want that either.
Mark, my guess is it depends on which bureaucrat answers the phone as far as how quickly things move.
If the MPCA commits to doing a cleanup on this site, it would probably take a year before they could actually start shoveling dirt. Because then, there's some more work that they should probably do. They should redo the LAF study. They should make sure they have a competent contractor, which is something that I want to be involved with. If the PCA is going to say they can't clean up the site again, I want to be at the table when they say that, because that's just wrong. I mean, yeah, it's going to be expensive, but whose fault is that? They let the site sit there for 40 years. That's why it's got to be so expensive.
Mark, I got a question for you. So will this fund ever run out then for the MPCA, or is that tied to the Petro Fund?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, like I said, the time is now to do something. The Petro Fund originally had sunset dates in it, but they recently extended it indefinitely. But someday it will go away. This is a pot of money. It's a huge pot of money. I don't think the public is even aware of how much money this fund brings in. The tax on gasoline is only in effect for maybe 4 months out of the year. It's 2 cents a gallon, and it more than fills up the funding that they need to do, all the work that the state does and all the fund finance work that they do too. The money's there. It's your money. You buy gas. You've been paying that tax. It's your money. So get the state to use that money to clean up the site that's contaminating your drinking water aquifer. It's pretty simple.
John, you're good at being the squeaky wheel?
Sarah, can I ask you to step up to the podium? I just have a question for you about some of these treatment costs.
Yeah.
Or maybe, the microphone's probably good enough if you just use a projecting voice. You talked about the air sparging and the chemical biotreatment, and I understand these are very back of envelope. But
Yes.
when you're talking about the range on the sparging costs, is that for the small site or everything? I guess I don't know.
Sheldon, I know you kind of pulled that together. I think they're pretty generic for,
Yeah, that's not considering of the volume of contamination. That's just a general range of what that technology will typically cost. I would expect that given the size of the El Napo plume at this site, you would be near the high end.
Sure. So whereas with the excavation, we were talking about a small scale and a large scale, these costs don't have that same differentiation on the sparging side of it. Is that correct? Okay.
yep,
So,
Scaling up an air sparging system is a lot cheaper than scaling up an excavation.
Yes, and
Okay.
that, the main reason that the excavation is based on size is because it's
Physical.
to get a cost per cubic yard of removal and a cost per ton of disposal. It's much harder to say, it's much harder to gauge air sparging because there's so many more factors as far as how much air would be required, how many injection points, how many extraction points, how many.
okay.
You're taking contaminated soil out of the ground, but where are you gonna put it?
Right. So what goes into these studies that the MPCA did that you reviewed? I guess, and I think Mark said maybe the sparging wasn't carefully enough studied, but if the sparging is only 300 to 400,000, how do you not just spend the $300,000, $400,000 already and be done with it? I guess, or is that not something that they looked at?
You know, they did not look specifically at that technology, and I do want to say that the scope of our report, you know, going back to that very basic sort of scope, was not, you know, I guess the genesis of the grant was Mr. Tusso's lawsuit. The scope of our report was not to basically serve in that auditing role of the MPCA or like the legislative auditor. We did not go into this saying, did MPCA do everything correct? You know, where did they stumble? We were looking at that much broader picture of what is the risk to the drinking water. There's a lot that goes into feasibility studies. There's a lot of investigation that leads up to it, like we've alluded to. They look at various different factors. Cost is one of them. But the time to clean up, is it technically practicable, are things that have to be taken into consideration and vary from site to site. You know, air sparge may be a very good solution here. However, the MPCA and everyone who does a feasibility study, we do feasibility studies for our private clients, those responsible parties that pay for the cleanup and things like that. There are different balancing factors that have to be taken into account. And one of the biggest ones is, are the receptors already protected? You know, I would love to clean up all of the contamination everywhere, in every city, including Painesville, including where I live in New Brighton, in the Twin Cities, where we have impacted drinking water from the Twin Cities Army Ammunition Plant and have full-time carbon treatment and full-time 1,4-dioxane treatment. However, there has to be some balance and evaluation of basically what's the bang that you get for the cleanup if the receptors are already protected and have safe drinking water. So that is something that, you know, if the city chooses to, you know, engage with the MPCA and ask for further evaluations of cleanup, of increased communication, which at an absolute minimum, you know, I would recommend, and I think Mark's recommendation to start at the commissioner's office is honestly a good one for this site. You know, it's just something that has to be taken into consideration, that they, to kind of what you said, Mayor Renke, you know, I sincerely hope that they would not take the stance of, what's this petulant child doing, you know, XYZ said, this is all fine, this is all fine. But they do have to balance resources as well. So I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of, you know, if there is this technology out there that could be used to at least partially clean up the source, you know, why wasn't that further looked at, or why wasn't that selected? There is just a lot that goes into that evaluation and decision. And for responsible parties, it's often that the agency has to approve, you know, what the selected remedy is. You know, in this case, the agency is acting, you know, they're taking on the responsibility and they're sort of the regulator.
So, and I have to apologize to you because as I went into this whole study thing, and I thought that was the purpose, was to do an audit on what the MPCA had done.
Right.
And now whether that was because of how the bill was written or how it was, it doesn't matter. That's, I think, why we're at this point asking these questions.
Yep,
is because
understood.
This was meant to sort of be that audit. Like if we were to do this all over again, what went wrong, what didn't? Can you speak a little bit, I think Mark raised some really good points about like the future, looking into the future of development and stuff like that. And maybe it was just outside the scope of the presentation, but I'm not entirely clear how that was addressed in the report, either that you did or MPCA's documents. Can you just speak a little bit to what the MPCA looked at for future development in making their decisions, if at all, if you know the answer?
Sheridan, I'm not sure how much that was considered in the MPCA reports.
Yeah, from what we
evaluations.
reviewed, there was not specific consideration of increased usage or changing usage or anything like that. What I will say about that though is, we recommended in our report that the MPCA continue to monitor Sentinel wells, that they increase the well network, and that they come up with a clear plan and communication with the city for what happens if contamination is detected at those Sentinel wells. So presumably, as your water use changes, if it does cause the plume to draw this way, the MPCA is still looking at this site and may reevaluate what they do in terms of cleanup or in terms of protecting the drinking water based on changing conditions.
Okay. Say I go knock on the commissioner's door tomorrow and I go, you need to sparge this area, clean it up, get it done. And she says, cool, and sends a truck out next week. What does that process look like? Like, I generally have no idea. Like, what does
It's
the,
massive digging, I've dug out a couple of them.
so like, and that's what I'm curious, like, are we, if MPCA says, yep, we're gonna do the chemical or sparging and clean it up and be done, so that we never have to talk about this again. What size of an area might we be looking at, if anybody knows? Are we talking about buying up houses and clearing land for it? What does that look like? And I see Mark shaking his head, but Sarah, you're at the podium, so I guess I'll ask you first.
No, I would, if the agency were to move forward with cleanup, I mean,
And I'm not asking you to say they should or shouldn't.
I totally get it. I totally get it. They would likely focus on the site itself, at least at first, because they own the site, they control the site. And if they're looking to do source removal, or not source removal, but addressing the source, that they would likely stay with the site. However, I can't and won't speak to what the MPCA can be made to do, and what would be required to persuade them. I think it is not insignificant and would take a not insignificant amount of time to do that. But in order to kind of follow their processes, all of the evaluations that we've talked about today, they would likely hire, as Mark mentioned, one of their contractors, so another consultant. It would not be us, but another consultant like Terracon or whomever. And they would have to sort of redo or relook at, because they would want to make sure that they would select the correct source remedy for the site. So they would presumably then look at these technologies and select or recommend what should be used, sort of the scope of that. If air sparge is selected, like Sheridan said, how many injection points or wells, how many SVE extraction wells, what's the size of the SVE blower, what sort of treatment do we need for the off gas. It is not a quick process on almost any site, apart from emergency response sites where, say, drinking water is impacted, or there's a true vapor intrusion issue and we need to get mitigation systems in immediately. So I know that the council and you all understand this, but this is not a slow process if MPCA could even be, convinced.
This is a slow process.
Yes, I'm sorry, this is a
That's
slow
okay.
process,
I
yeah.
don't want somebody quoting you saying this is not a slow
Right.
process. No, and I guess, we all get that. I'm just thinking if we did a large-scale excavation, then we're likely talking about buying homes, ripping up space.
Yes.
That's a hot mess, but if we can do the sparging and treat it that way, we're not displacing residents, presumably. I mean, maybe there's something, but presumably we can do it with the land that's there. Okay, I'm seeing nods, yes, from the engineers in the room, good. Okay, all right. And I understand, yeah, they've got to bring in their own people and make their own decisions. Okay.
I have a question for Mark, maybe you can answer this. I'm just picturing this, the MPCA owns that lot, what is it, 50 by 50 maybe? So if they were to excavate that and dig out 50 by 50 by 20 or 30 feet deep, I could see that happening. And 40 years ago, that would have done a world of good. That'd be the dirt and land that's soaked up the gasoline, and that was right where that was. How much good would that do to the overall plume to remove that much dirt?
So I'm not really familiar with how much of the actual source area is on the property versus off the property, but I'm guessing it's at least 50% or even more. If you can remove 50% of a source area, that is significant. I mean, a lot of the goals for cleanup sites are like, you know, let's get as much as we can. Oh, we got 50% out. Well, that's about as good as we can do. But as long as you can shrink, because the smaller the source area, the smaller the plume, the smaller the fire, the smaller the smoke cloud. And if that's, you know, farther away from your wells, and things do change in the future, then you don't have to worry about it so much. But, you know, the proposal from the agency is we'll just spend $25,000 a year, we'll drill more wells, we'll spend more money to not spend more money. It's like, why don't you just take the money and just clean it up? If you would have done that 20 years ago, it would have cost them less than they've spent to date on this site. So they're just constantly throwing money at this for no good at the site, which is really frustrating. It's like, you should have just cleaned it up when you had the chance.
All right. We're running on about the 2-hour mark, and I know I'm starting to fade. So I'm going to suggest that we start looking at wrapping this. A couple things that I want to make sure that I get out before I forget to say them. One is that I've been in talks with staff who manage our city website. These reports are going to be put on our city's website along with any of the other documentation that we have, because I think that the transparency and the information is important. I also want to, the council knows this, but I'm going to tell the people in the room, nothing that we're talking about here is confidential. We get that things like, oh, we're looking at whether or not our water is safe to drink is scary. But again, it goes back to the point we were discussing earlier. Our water is safe to drink. This is looking out 20, 30, 50 years into the future and making sure that we do what we can to keep it that way. It is safe. But nothing here is confidential. We're not hiding anything. So everything's going online. We're going to do that. But I would like a sense from the committee members in the room, because you are all serving on these committees and giving of your time to help advise us as a city council. Having heard the discussion, been around for a while, recommendations from all of you on what we might do next. I have my own ideas, but I'd like to hear from those sitting out there before I open my yap too much further.
Steve, you're smiling, go ahead.
I worked at Elk River landfill for 3 years, and we had a lot of contaminated soil brought to our landfill. And all we did was sprinkle that on top of the paper at night so the paper didn't blow around. And according to MPCA and the pollution control school that I went to, the sun breaks that down and becomes harmless. Well, when we don't get sunlight underground, it's harmful for nearly forever. It does, like Mark said, a long time break down. My opinion, for the 2 cents it's worth, I say excavate it. Then it's gone.
and I'll agree with that. Like I said, a 50 by 50 by 30 foot hole, that could get done
I think it'd be
easily.
that much.
Well, sure it would be, but I mean,
But yeah.
without buying up
that's-
houses
that's
around
the
it,
way it's gone forever. I don't know about these air treatments, I'm not.
and it might be too late
So I
to do a
can't
whole lot of
comment
good,
on
it's a
that.
heck of a lot better than doing nothing.
But,
We should have
Yeah, I
done it 40
agree with
years
you.
ago. The MCCA should have done it.
but the more of it we can get out, the better off we are too.
I agree.
I know Bev wants us to keep pumping and dumping because then it goes into the lake for her.
Yeah, right. I'm just, if you got a problem, this is the John service station we're working with. You got, just down the block was the other service station, a little bitty white thing, I don't remember the name. Then you got this one over here, 76. Is this all in the whole town? Are we gonna keep having more problems? Or is this just, this is the only thing we know about?
So this is the only one, I'm looking at the two because I know you looked at the causation a little bit in the report. This is the only one we know about, but there's also no indication that there's anything else. And we don't know.
That's not. There were some other files that we looked at from the MPCA for other sites. None were to this magnitude.
Okay.
They're smaller.
So to your point,
But yes.
in a developed area like the city, where there has been gas stations and other petroleum and other chemical use, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And you might, certainly MPCA, in reviewing their information, we agree that this particular site seems to be the primary source. However, there may be others out there, and removing this source, you remove this source, but there may be other impacts as well. And that's where, like we've talked about, the drinking water is safe, the well management and treatment must remain and will remain like a very important part of whatever's decided at the Midtown Service Station site.
Do you have an estimate, if it is excavated, just how long all these wells have to be around our town? Well, they're really an eyesore, especially the group of wells on site. Would they be gone if it's excavated? Or, I got one between mine and Dewey's house, we have two wells right there.
Right.
Are they gonna be there for a long time, even after it's excavated, to keep monitoring, I'm guessing?
Yes.
But the group of wells will probably be gone, other than maybe one for monitoring?
Like at the actual
I
site.
got a lot of people, I drink a lot of coffee, so a lot of people ask me, what are all those wells for? We would tell them, oh, there was a gasoline leak at one time. And that doesn't bode well for the city, in my opinion.
Right.
Well, the
Yeah,
wells,
it's-
it kind of depends on how long you want to watch it, but if you do an excavation, that's like, if you want to just kill it tomorrow, excavate, because that'll do it. And then once you excavate, you can use your wells you have, I don't need to install anymore, monitor it for maybe 3 or 4 years. If everything sort of goes like, ooh, like you think it's going to, or hope it's going to, then what's the point of monitoring anymore? You might need 1 or 2, but you certainly can get rid of this big well network you got in your whole town. I mean, that's the whole purpose of cleaning it up, is not having to monitor it.
Oh, I had one in my piece.
I'm not used to a group of public works guys being so quiet back there.
They're just listening.
Well, I've been involved in this
I was gonna say, Dave,
for over 30 years,
yeah.
and I don't know what kind of pull Mark has got, but I have dealt with the MPCA. I have sat in the room with them and state legislators, the Minnesota Department of Health, and if there's a big dog in the room, it's MPCA. And to get them to change their mind, we had to do an end run around them to get the stripper plant. They were dead set against it. Their idea of how to fix the problem here is if we decided, or if we got benzene in the water to the point where we couldn't use the wells, they'd truck in bottled water. That's what we did.
That was
That's what
the
we
one
did.
plan.
That was their answer. And we asked them, how many truckloads a day do you think AMPI would take? And they didn't really have an answer. But MPCA, I don't know what kind of swing you've got, but from everything that I've ever seen and dealt with in the last 30-some years with MPCA, it's not as easy as you think it's gonna be.
Well, it's not the swing I got, it's the swing you got. And you were swinging down here with the lower level managers, but Michael Canner was the big impetus telling you no. You need to go higher up the chain. You can actually go all the way to the governor's office.
We
wanna
had,
get
Where is he right now?
we had his representatives here. We had state senators here. We had state representatives here.
He just lied to all of them. He's been lying about this site and about our cleanup program. We're the only state in the country.
Canner, you mean?
Yeah, Michael Canner. We're the only state in the country that does not use EPA's Rebecca cleanup risk assessment methodology. 49 states use it, Minnesota doesn't. And they claim theirs is equivalent. Well, then why did the Minnesota auditor have this big report saying you're not looking at the future? That's the whole part of risk assessment.
So Dave, how do you go forward from here? Or do we say what we've done is
No,
enough?
I don't think we should stop at all. I think we should do whatever we can. If Mark can get the MPCA off their dime, more power to him, and let's take advantage of it and do whatever it takes to clean that damn thing up once and for all.
Is there anybody who disagrees? Okay.
If Mark can pull this off, I'd even suggest to the city that it gets compensated somewhat for it.
Well, the mayor owes me lunch. He said that for years.
Well, he can buy you lunch, while he's writing you a check.
Make an escape bill.
Yeah. Well,
The mayor's contemplating alcohol after this, if you want. But
That's just a rumor.
As we all should.
So, okay, I mean, the last thing I want to say is to the engineers who are here, Sarah, Sheridan, Mark, thank you all. On behalf of us as a city, those of us in the room on the council and our committees and everybody in town, thank you all. I know these things get heated, we get emotional, we get excited, but it's because this is about something that deeply matters, and I think you know that, and we care. And the work that you've all put into this, the time that you've given to come here and tell us the same things over and over again, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, really. And we are going to, we have the recommendations that we've started to implement, at least a little bit. Staff are working on getting those things working. That, I think, Ron, was, now that I'm saying it out loud, that was the email from MPCA, was starting some of the testing protocols and getting those implemented that you had recommended. So we are working on some of those things. But I do seriously want to thank all of you for the work that you've done on this, and that the work that you may or may not continue to do on this. Thank you, it matters a lot. And we will continue working from here.
I have a short comment. Having been involved in this as long as Dave, because I've been on council for so many years, it didn't get cleaned up mostly because we took them at what they told us was what we should do. And it should have been done a long time ago, but we did what they advised us to do, and that's why it's still a problem.
Well, they're counting on us not knowing any better. No, they
Exactly.
started
And we
engineers.
didn't. And we
No, they
didn't.
started engineers, we have more information to work with that we didn't have
Yep.
30 years ago.
And sometimes in tough conversations like this, we start moving forward, and this is where I can see the hope.
So we have a recommendation that we continue to work with the MPCA to clean it up, and I think that I don't disagree with anything that the report from R says. I think that the scope of the project was insufficient. And that had it been a greater scope, we might have a different report. And I think that's where some of the dissatisfaction that might be sensed is coming from, is based on the scope of the report. So I think that the report is helpful and it's informative, especially in terms of how we look forward and look at the risk in the future. So I do mean it. Thank you so much for all your work and being here tonight, everyone. With that, I think we're going to go get some sleep. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so was